Good morning and welcome to Adult Story Time this morning. It's the holiday season and we're taking our stories from the book Christmas Remembered by Tomie DePaola. And the story that we've chosen for this morning is A Candy Cane Christmas. Come, read with me. A Candy Cane Christmas. In 1948, our neighbors, the Nadiles, Gladys and Joe, and their daughters Paulette, who was Buddy's age, and Sheila, who was a little younger than I was, moved to Lindsley Avenue. They had bought a small candy store downtown on Hanover Street, right around the corner from the main bus stop. It was called the Candy Kettle. There's nothing better than having friends who own a candy store. And whenever I took the bus home from downtown, I stopped in at the Candy Kettle. Often, Mrs. Nadile was behind the counter of glass cases, which displayed the most delicious homemade candy in the world. Even though Mr. Nadile was a teacher at the high school, he had thrown himself into candy making with all the artistry and invention that Italian artists have been practicing for centuries. The shelves were filled with hand-dipped chocolates with the little swirls on top indicating what kind of fillings were inside. Chocolate-covered caramels, butter crunch, raspberry cream, and the best, chocolate-covered cherries. I didn't like the maple cream or almond cream at all. Not only were there exotic items like gooey, nutty, chocolate-covered turtles, but also bark made of 3 kinds of chocolate, dark, milk, and white. They offered chocolate and panache fudge for the less adventurous, and cellophane-wrapped lollipops of every flavor imaginable, including spearmint, root beer, and butterscotch, filled shiny glass jars on the tops of the counters. I mean, we're talking the Tiffany's of candy stores right here in Meriden, Connecticut. I was always full of questions for Mrs. Nadile, but what I wanted to know the most was how Mr. Nadile made his molasses sponge candy. It was hard candy, yet light as a feather and made of pale yellow tan, molassesy tasting foam that dissolved on my tongue with a chewy crackle. Mrs. Nadile must have remembered, because one day in early December, Mr. Nadile invited me to spend a Saturday afternoon in the kitchen, the workroom where they made the candy. They were going to be cooking a batch of molasses sponge. The kitchen had an enormous metal table in the middle. Off to one side was another good-sized table with a marble top, a triple sink, and on the wall a giant metal hook. Tucked off in its own corner was a squat gas stove where the sugar, corn syrup, water, and any other ingredients were heated to lava-like temperatures and made into candy. The stove accommodated various sizes of metal rings that could be added or removed to hold the round copper candy kettles, dark with heat patina, on the sides, outsides, and gleaming on the insides. A big tub next to the stove held 6 tall wooden paddles used to stir the bubbling mass as it was cooking. Bottles of flavorings, colors, and extracts stood on the shelves around the workroom. "Okay, Tommy, put this on," Mr. Nadile said, handing me a white apron that looked just like the one Tommy, my grandfather, wore in his meat and grocery store. "We're going to be dealing with some very hot stuff, so be careful and stand out of the way. The candy is hot as lava," he told me. He lit the stove with a whoosh, moved a ring or two, and put one of the copper kettles on the fire. He poured in the molasses and added sugar and a few other ingredients. The mixture began to bubble like a witch's cauldron. He stirred the bubbling mass and checked it with a candy thermometer. "Okay," Mr. Nadile announced, "it's ready." Mr. Nadile poured in a big cupful of baking soda. The dark lava suddenly foamed up like nothing I had ever seen before. A man who was there to help had arranged 4 metal bars in a rectangle on the lightly greased large table. They would keep the lava-hot mixture from flowing off onto the floor until it cooled down. Wearing heavy gloves, Mr. Nadile and his helper picked up the kettle by its round handles and poured the foaming mixture onto the table. Mrs. Nadile opened a valve, which started cold water running through the pipes under the metal surface of the table. "Cold water cools the candy off quickly," she told me. The table can be used as a cold table or a hot table, whatever we need. The bubbly mass of foam settled down, pushing up against the metal bars on the cold table. Gradually, the blanket of yellow-tan, molassesy smelling foam stopped seething and looked pretty solid. Mr. Nadile moved one of the metal bars. The edge of the foam was nice and firm. It was amazing. The bottom was a smooth layer of taffy. The top was more irregular. The entire middle looked exactly like a sponge, a veritable irregular honeycomb of spaces, just waiting to melt on the tongue of its greatest admirer, me. Now I knew all the secrets of molasses sponge candy. Mr. Nadile picked up a large half-circle cutter called a mezzaluna, or half moon, held it with both hands, chopped off a piece, and gave it to me to eat. I thought it was the best I had ever tasted. I stayed until it was time to close. Mrs. Nadile gave me a bag of molasses sponge to take with me. Tell Flossie to put it in an airtight tin. It melts if it's in moist air. The Nadiles gave me a ride home. On the way, they asked me if I would like to help them in the store at Christmas. Sheila would be helping too. Sure, I said. Maybe we can wear red caps and be Santa's helpers in the kitchen. We did, and I ended up with 2 important jobs. The first was crooking the candy canes. The second was crimping the ribbon candy. The candy kettle was famous for its homemade candy canes and ribbon candy. They sold every mint flavor imaginable in candy canes. Peppermint, of course, wintergreen, double mint, clove, cinnamon, and my favorite, spearmint. They made the same flavors in ribbon candy, as well as cherry, lime, orange, root beer, and peanut butter filled. We made the canes first. Mr. Nadile boiled the mixture of sugar, corn syrup, and water in the copper kettle. Then he poured it on the table. He divided it into one large piece and a number of smaller pieces that would become the colored stripes. First, Mr. Nadile put the large piece on the wall hook and pulled it like taffy to just add enough air. When it turned white, he put it back on the table under a heat lamp to keep it pliable. Then he put the smaller pieces on the wall hook, adding flavor and coloring for the stripes. The colored taffy was pulled into long strips that were then put on the surface of the white block of candy. Mr. Nadile and his helper put on heavy, heat-proof gloves and began pulling the block of candy until it was the right size for candy canes. Then they cut it into pieces with big shears. Next, they rolled the pieces so the stripes twirled up the cane. The bottom was rolled thinner than the top. Now it was my turn to crook. I placed the canes along a heavy metal rod to keep them straight. I put a crook in each one before they cooled off. Then I moved them down to the part of the table that was cold so they would harden. I had a good eye, so they were all crooked just right. The ribbon candy started off the same way, except it was pulled flat instead of rolled. A length would be cut off. I'd grab it with my left gloved hand and put the end into a contraption that put the first loose crimp or accordion fold in it. I turned a handle with my right hand, and when the length of candy came out, I gently pushed the ends to tighten the crimps. Just like the canes, I would move the ribbon down to a cold part of the table to set. Working at the candy kettle was a great experience. I'll never forget the order we got a few days before Christmas. A man came in with an unusual request. His wife loved peppermint, and he wanted to surprise her with a candy cane as tall as she was. Mr. Nadile was up for the task. The candy cane would be 5 foot 3 inches tall. It would have 2 thin strips of green and a wider stripe of red against a white background. It would be peppermint flavored, of course. It was the last order we made before we closed for Christmas Eve. When it was time to make the crook, Mr. Nadile let me do it. After it had cooled, the candy cane was lifted onto a wooden base, covered in clear cellophane and tied with ribbons. We looked at our masterpiece and cheered. The customer was very impressed and pleased with our work. It was time to close up shop and go home for Christmas Eve. Mr. Nadile gave everyone a little Christmas bonus and told us we did a great job. The next holiday is Valentine's Day, so rest up. We'll see you later tonight at your folks' home, Tomie. Mr. Nadal said as I left, "and thanks a lot. You're the best crooker and crimper in Connecticut. Merry Christmas." And that's our story time for the day. I hope this story brought back memories of candy making from either when you were young or memories you now share with children and grandchildren. Until next week, stay safe, be healthy, and have a wonderful week.